On a silent Christmas night in a forgotten mountain town, the wind refused to be quiet, and a single choice changed everything. A tired police officer nearly drove past. A loyal dog refused to let him, and beneath the snow, two small lives were waiting for someone to stop. This is not a story about heroes. It is a story about listening when the world whispers. If you have ever wondered whether one moment can still matter, stay with us, tell us where you are, watching from. In the comments, your voice matters here, and if stories of hope, loyalty, and second chances touch your heart, please press subscribe to support this channel so we can keep sharing stories like this with you. Christmas Eve in Pine Hollow, Colorado, arrived without celebration. The town sat tucked between dark pine forests and frozen ridgelines, a place so small that most storms passed over it without ever being named. On this night, snow fell relentlessly, thick and heavy, blurring the string of Christmas lights along Main Street until they looked less like decorations and more like exhausted stars struggling to stay awake. The wind moved through the narrow streets with a low, restless moan, not violent yet, but insistent, as if warning the town that sleep would not come easily. Officer Matthew Cole drove his patrol cruiser slower than the posted limit, tires crunching softly over fresh snow. He was 39 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the quiet, weathered strength of a man who had learned to carry weight without complaint. His dark hair was cut short, practical, already flecked with gray at the temples. A faint scar traced his jawline, a souvenir from a domestic call years ago that had turned ugly before turning quiet. His eyes, a muted gray blue, rarely revealed much. People in Pine Hollow described him as steady, dependable, and distant in a way that felt respectful rather than cold. 17 years in law enforcement had shaped him into a man who understood silence. He knew when a town needed flashing lights and firm voices, and when it simply needed to be left alone. Tonight was supposed to be the second kind. No calls, no drunks spilling out of the tavern, no stranded tourists foolish enough to challenge the mountain weather. Just snow, darkness, and a few warm houses holding on to their fragile circles of light. In the passenger seat sat Shadow. Shadow was a 7-year-old German shepherd, large even for his breed, with a thick sable coat that darkened along his back like spilled ink. His left ear bore a permanent notch, the result of shrapnel from a deployment overseas, back when he had served as a military working dog before injuries forced his retirement. His amber eyes were alert, but calm, carrying an intelligence that went beyond training. Shadow did not waste energy. He watched, he waited, he remembered. With people he was quiet but loyal, choosing closeness over affection. With Matthew, he was never more than an arm's length away. Matthew had adopted Shadow 4 years earlier, shortly after the dog's handler was killed in a roadside explosion. The transition had not been easy. Shadow had arrived wary, slow to trust, flinching at sudden sounds. Matthew, fresh from his own season of loss, had understood without words. They had learned each other gradually, two wounded beings discovering that companionship did not require explanation. The cruiser moved past the closed hardware store, the darkened diner, the small church whose steeple was already half buried in snow. Matthew's radio remained silent. His gloved hand rested loosely on the steering wheel. He allowed himself to think about nothing at all, which, for him, was the closest thing to rest. Then Shadow shifted. It was subtle, a tightening of muscles, a change in posture, not a bark, not a whine, just movement. Matthew noticed the dog's breathing change before anything else. Slower, deeper, focused. Shadow's head lifted slightly, nose angling toward the cracked window. His ears rose, not in alarm, but in attention. "What is it?" Matthew asked quietly, more out of habit than concern. Shadow did not respond. He rarely did. His eyes remained fixed, scanning something Matthew could not yet perceive. Then it reached him. Not a sound, a smell. Fear had a scent. Matthew had learned that long ago. Panic smelled sharp and acidic. Desperation smelled thin, almost metallic. This was different. This was weak, fading, layered with cold and damp wood and something animal. Something young. Matthew's instinct told him to keep driving. The storm was strengthening. The temperature was dropping fast. His shift would end in 20 minutes. Rationally, whatever it was could wait until daylight, until backup, until roads were safer. Shadow did not lie back down. Instead, he leaned forward, muscles taut. gaze locked toward the edge of town, where the road narrowed and the forest pressed closer. His tail was still. His body spoke a single message with absolute clarity. Stop. Matthew exhaled slowly. All right, he murmured, as much to himself as to the dog. He eased the cruiser off the main road, tires sliding slightly before finding purchase. They came to a halt near an abandoned lumber shed that had not seen use in decades, its roof sagging under the weight of snow, its wooden walls warped and gray with age. The moment Matthew opened the door, the wind struck him full in the face. Snow lashed sideways, stinging his cheeks and seeping instantly into his collar. The cold was sharper here, unbuffered by buildings, carried straight from the forest. He pulled his hat lower and stepped out, boots sinking deep with each movement. Shadow leapt down beside him, silent, purposeful. At first, Matthew heard nothing beyond the wind. He stood still, letting the world settle, the way years of patrol work had taught him. He closed his eyes for just a second. Then he heard it, a sound too small to belong to the storm, too irregular to be wind through broken boards. A thin, broken cry, almost lost the moment it surfaced, as if whatever made it did not have the strength to try again. Matthew's stomach tightened. He moved around the side of the shed, Shadow pacing just ahead, guiding rather than pulling. Under the frozen overhang, partially obscured by hanging sheets of ice, he saw them. 2 German shepherd puppies. They could not have been more than 8 weeks old. Their bodies were small, underfed, fur clumped with snow and ice. Rough rope bound them at the chest, looped cruelly over an old wooden beam so that their paws barely touched the ground. One hung limp, head slumped forward, eyes closed. The other trembled faintly, ribs fluttering with shallow breaths. For a moment, Matthew could not move. The world narrowed to the sight of those tiny bodies swaying slightly as the wind pushed through the shed. Rage flared hot and immediate, followed by something heavier, colder. He had seen cruelty before, too much of it. But something about the timing, the deliberate choice of night and storm and holiday, cut deeper than usual. He dropped to his knees in the snow, ignoring the cold seeping through his uniform. "No," he whispered, voice breaking despite himself. He reached out carefully, fingers shaking as he tested the rope, already stiff with ice. "No, not tonight." Shadow stood close, pressing his body against Matthew's side, offering warmth without demand. His ears were back now, not in fear, but in grief, a low sound vibrating in his chest. Matthew swallowed hard. His breath came out in uneven clouds. "Not on Christmas," he said aloud, as if speaking it might make it true. He did not yet know who had done this. He did not know why. He did not know what would come next. All he knew was that the wind could scream, and the snow could bury roads, and the night could try to erase what it wanted. But not this. Not tonight. Matthew drove with both hands tight on the steering wheel, the patrol cruiser cutting through the storm as if pushing against something alive. Snow struck the windshield in thick sheets, the wipers struggling to keep pace. He had wrapped the 2 puppies inside his coat, their fragile bodies pressed against his chest, feeling impossibly light and impossibly heavy at the same time. Shadow sat rigid in the back seat, amber eyes fixed on the bundle Matthew held, his body tense with focus rather than fear. The cabin lay a mile beyond the edge of town, hidden among tall pines that creaked and swayed under the growing weight of snow. Matthew had built it himself years ago, board by board, after his marriage ended and silence became something he needed rather than feared. It was modest, practical, and stubbornly warm once the fire caught. A place that had never asked questions. He carried the puppies inside without turning on the lights. Muscle memory guided him through the space. Boots off, door bolted, firewood stacked beside the hearth. The cabin smelled faintly of pine resin, old smoke, and Shadow's fur. Cold followed him in like an unwelcome guest. Matthew laid the puppies down on a folded blanket near the fireplace, but not too close. He knew better. Shock was as dangerous as frostbite. Too much heat too fast could kill just as surely as the cold had nearly done. He knelt, removing his gloves with fingers that had gone clumsy. The puppy on the left was completely limp, its small chest barely moving, eyes sealed shut as if sleep had already claimed it. The other trembled weakly, a thin sound slipping from its throat that barely qualified as a whine. "Easy," Matthew murmured, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used with accident victims and frightened children. "You're inside now. You're safe." Shadow approached slowly and lay down beside the blanket without being asked. At 7 years old, his movements were deliberate, economical. He positioned his body to block drafts, his warmth radiating outward. His scarred ear twitched once, then settled. Matthew lit the fire carefully, coaxing it rather than forcing it. The first flames licked uncertainly at the kindling before catching hold, crackling softly as if surprised to be alive again. The fire's glow pushed back the darkness inch by inch, painting the log walls in amber light. Time became something vague. Matthew worked slowly, methodically. He checked gums for color, rubbed tiny paws to encourage circulation, wrapped the puppies in dry cloths warmed near the hearth. He spoke to them constantly, not because he believed they understood the words, but because silence felt dangerous now. The puppy that did not respond worried him most. Matthew pressed his fingers gently against its chest, counting heartbeats with a precision born of training and dread. They were there, weak but present. Shadow let out a low, steady breath, as if anchoring the room. An hour passed, maybe 2. The storm outside howled louder, battering the cabin walls, but inside the fire grew stronger, steady and patient. Matthew felt the ache in his knees, the burn in his shoulders, but he ignored it. Pain was familiar. This was different. The trembling puppy suddenly jerked, a sharp, involuntary movement that sent Matthew's heart racing. "That's it," he whispered. "That's good." The puppy's breathing deepened slightly, still uneven but no longer fading. Its eyes fluttered, not opening, but acknowledging something beyond the dark. Matthew exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned his attention back to the other pup, rubbing warmth into its limbs, speaking its name only in his head because he refused to name something that might not stay. Naming made things real. Naming made loss sharper. Shadow shifted closer, his broad chest rising and falling beside the blanket. Matthew rested his hand briefly on the dog's neck, grounding himself in the familiar solidity there. "You're doing good," he told Shadow quietly, "just like always." The night dragged on. Matthew brewed weak broth on the stove and used a dropper to moisten the puppies' mouths, careful not to overwhelm them. He checked the clock once, then stopped. Time had no meaning here. There was only before and after. Sometime near dawn, when the storm outside softened into a steady fall rather than a roar, the second puppy moved, just a little, a twitch of the tail, a shallow breath that did not stutter. Matthew froze, afraid to disturb the moment. Then the puppy let out a tiny, broken sound that was unmistakably alive. Matthew laughed once sharply, the sound startling even himself. He scrubbed a hand over his face, leaving a smear of soot and exhaustion. "Okay," he said hoarsely. "Okay." He did not celebrate. He did not allow himself that yet. Survival was not victory. It was simply permission to keep going. The fire crackled. Shadow's eyes finally softened, tension easing from his frame as if a long-held order had been lifted. As the sky outside lightened from black to slate gray, Matthew sat back against the hearth, exhaustion settling over him like a blanket. The puppies lay curled together now, bodies touching, breath rising and falling in fragile synchrony. He studied them closely for the first time. They were clearly littermates, but different in subtle ways. One was slightly larger, with a darker mask around the eyes, its muzzle broad even in infancy. The other was slimmer, lighter in color, a white patch marking its chest like a small, accidental blessing. Both bore the unmistakable features of German shepherds, ears already hinting at the shapes they would one day hold. Matthew realized then that he had been holding something inside himself shut for years. A door, quietly locked, unnoticed until the moment it creaked open. He cleared his throat. "I suppose," he said softly, feeling foolish and unsteady, "you should have names." The larger puppy shifted, pressing closer to the warmth. "Noel," Matthew said, testing the sound. "Because you made it through the night." The smaller one sighed faintly, a breath more than a sound. "And Grace," he added, voice dropping, "because I don't have a better reason." The names settled into the room, not dramatic, not sacred, just honest. Outside, the first pale light of morning touched the snow-laden trees. The storm had not ended, but it had loosened its grip, as if satisfied with what it had taken. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily now, no longer struggling, no longer uncertain. It warmed the walls, the air, the quiet spaces Matthew had never thought to fill again. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes for just a moment, listening to 3 sets of breathing and the soft pop of the fire. For the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel empty. The storm loosened its grip on Pine Hollow 3 days later, not retreating entirely, but stepping back just enough to remind the town that it still existed. Snow remained everywhere, on rooftops, fences, and tree limbs bowed low under its weight. But the wind softened, trading its howl for a restless whisper that drifted through the pines. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with unshed light. Matthew Cole had not gone into town once. He spent those days moving between the fireplace, the couch, and the space near the window where Noel and Grace slept, bundled together in a padded crate borrowed from the back of the patrol cruiser. The puppies were still weak, still fragile, but they were alive. That was enough for now. Noel, the larger of the two, had begun to lift his head when Matthew approached, dark eyes following movement with cautious curiosity. Grace tired more easily. She slept longer, her breathing steady but shallow, her small body rising and falling, like something still deciding whether it belonged in the world. Shadow rarely left their side. He lay close enough to touch them, his body angled protectively, ears always half alert. Despite his age, despite the stiffness that crept into his joints on cold mornings, he remained vigilant. Responsibility once learned did not fade. Matthew himself looked worse than he felt. He hadn't shaved. His uniform hung looser than usual, as if exhaustion had thinned him out. He moved quietly, efficiently, but there was a tension beneath every action, a sense of waiting for something unnamed to arrive. The knock came late morning, 3 firm taps against the cabin door, not hurried, not hesitant. Shadow rose instantly, positioning himself between the crate and Matthew, a low sound rumbling in his chest. Matthew raised a hand, signaling calm, then crossed the room and opened the door. Eleanor Brooks stood on the porch, snow dusting the shoulders of her long wool coat. She was a woman in her early 60s, average height, with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back into a loose knot that never quite stayed neat. Her face bore the gentle lines of someone who had smiled often and the deeper creases of someone who had worried longer than she let on. Her eyes were a clear, observant hazel, sharp enough to notice what others missed, soft enough to keep those observations from becoming weapons. Eleanor had lived in Pine Hollow longer than Matthew. She ran the town's informal heart as much as the church ran its calendar. She organized meals when someone fell ill, remembered birthdays no one else did, and listened more than she spoke. Tragedy had shaped her quietly. She had lost her husband to a logging accident 20 years earlier, raising 2 sons who had long since left town. Loss had not hardened her. It had refined her. She held a woven basket in her gloved hands. "You haven't come into town all week," she said, her voice calm, warm, carrying no accusation. "We noticed." Matthew stepped aside to let her in. The cabin was clean but sparse. No photographs on the walls, no decorations, just functional furniture, the fire burning low, and the unmistakable presence of animals. Eleanor's gaze moved from Shadow to the crate near the hearth. She did not approach immediately. She observed. "So that's why," she murmured. Matthew nodded once. Eleanor set the basket on the table. The smell of apple bread and cinnamon filled the room, grounding, familiar. "I thought you might need something warm," she said. "Food has a way of reminding people they're still part of the world." Matthew didn't respond right away. He gestured toward the chairs, but Eleanor shook her head and remained standing, hands folded loosely in front of her. He told her what happened, not dramatically, not with emphasis. He described the storm, the patrol, Shadow's reaction, the shed. He described the ropes, the cold, the puppies hanging beneath the frozen roof. He did not editorialize. He did not speculate. Eleanor listened without interruption. Her expression did not change, but something in her posture tightened, as if she were bracing against a quiet blow. When Matthew finished, silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. After a long moment, Eleanor spoke. "Last Sunday," she said slowly, "a boy named Caleb stayed after church longer than usual. He's 8, talks too much. People don't always listen." Matthew leaned back against the counter, arms crossed loosely. "He told me he'd seen 2 men near the old lumber shed," she continued. "Said they were arguing. Said one of them had a truck he didn't recognize. It was just before the storm rolled in." Matthew's jaw tightened. I mentioned it to a few folks, Eleanor said. They dismissed it, said the boy was imagining things, or confusing hunters with someone else. She looked at Matthew directly now. I didn't dismiss it, Matthew nodded. I didn't know. No, she agreed gently. You wouldn't have. She glanced again toward the crate, where Noel shifted slightly in his sleep. Grace did not move. There are some things, Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully, that don't need to be spoken loudly. They need to be carried until the right moment. Matthew considered that. He thought of the rope, of the knots, of how deliberate they had been. He walked to the table and pulled a sealed evidence bag from a drawer. Inside lay a short length of rope, coiled neatly. I kept this, he said, before the weather could erase it. Eleanor leaned closer but did not touch the bag. That's not hunting rope, she said quietly. No, Matthew agreed. Industrial grade, treated, expensive. Eleanor straightened slowly. Then, whoever did this planned it. Matthew did not respond. Eleanor's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. You don't need to tell me what you believe about this, she said, or what it means. Just know you're not alone in seeing it. Shadow exhaled softly, settling back down. Outside, the wind stirred the trees again, not angry now, just persistent. Eleanor picked up her basket. I won't stay, she said. The puppies need quiet. She paused at the door. Matthew, she added, Christmas doesn't end when the day passes. Sometimes it waits. He met her eyes. I'm not a man of faith, he said finally. Eleanor smiled faintly. Neither am I, she replied. Not the loud kind. She stepped back into the snow, pulling her coat tighter as the door closed behind her. Matthew stood still for a long moment, listening to the quiet hum of the cabin, the fire, the breathing of 3 dogs. He did not think about miracles. He thought about rope. Daylight in Pine Hollow arrived reluctantly, as if the sun itself questioned the wisdom of showing its face after what the storm had done. The sky remained pale and overcast, a thin veil of gray stretching from ridge to ridge. Snow lay everywhere, undisturbed in places, compressed and scarred in others, telling quiet stories to anyone who knew how to read them. Matthew Cole returned to the abandoned lumber shed just after noon. He did not wear his uniform. Instead, he dressed in layered winter gear, dark jacket, insulated pants, boots meant for long hours in deep snow. The absence of a badge was deliberate. This was not a rescue. It was not an arrest. It was confirmation. He carried a small body camera clipped inside his coat and a phone sealed in a weatherproof case. Procedure mattered now more than instinct. Shadow moved ahead of him, attached by a short leash more for formality than control. In daylight, the dog's age was more apparent. His muzzle had begun to silver, and his movements carried a careful economy, but his focus was undiminished. Shadow worked differently than younger dogs. He did not rush, he assessed. The shed looked smaller in the light, less monstrous, more pathetic. Snow had collapsed part of the roof, and icicles hung like dull teeth along the edge. Matthew paused several yards away, scanning the area, letting the forest speak. The wind had stilled, but sound traveled strangely in cold air. Every footstep felt louder than it should have been. Matthew circled the structure slowly, careful not to trample anything that didn't belong to him. Near the back corner, where drifting snow had piled high, Shadow stopped. His body stiffened, nose pressed low to the ground. Matthew crouched. Boot prints. They were heavy, deliberate impressions, compressed deep into the frozen earth beneath the snow. Not the scattered tracks of hikers or hunters. These were straight, purposeful, made by someone carrying weight. The tread pattern was industrial, wide-lugged, meant for work rather than wilderness. Matthew activated the camera and documented the prints from multiple angles, measuring stride length, direction, depth. He followed the line only as far as was safe, marking points of interest mentally. Near the beam where the puppies had been tied, he found what he'd hoped not to and expected anyway. Fibers from the rope still clung to the wood, embedded in splinters where it had been cut away. He photographed them carefully. Shadow sniffed the air, then turned his head toward the forest. Matthew followed his gaze. The tracks led away from the shed, narrowing as they entered the trees. Snowfall had softened their edges, but had not erased them. Matthew hesitated. He knew the limits of his role. He was alone. Backup was miles away. The storm had taught him patience once, already. He advanced slowly, only far enough to understand the story the ground was telling. The forest grew denser, the light dimmer. Pine branches sagged, overhead, shedding snow with soft, sudden sighs. Matthew's breath fogged in front of him, steady, controlled. Shadow moved with quiet confidence, stopping often, checking scent, then moving again. About 300 yards in, the terrain changed. The snow thinned under the trees, revealing patches of trampled earth and broken needles. Someone had been here repeatedly, not passing through, staying. Matthew slowed further, pulse ticking up just enough to sharpen his senses. He saw the structure before he smelled it. A small cabin, half hidden among the pines, its roof camouflaged with branches and snow. Smoke did not rise from its chimney. No lights shone from its windows. It was deliberately quiet, deliberately invisible. Matthew stopped. He raised a hand, and Shadow froze beside him, muscles taut but silent. This was the line. Matthew did not approach. He did not draw his weapon. He documented. He zoomed in carefully, capturing the outline of the structure, the path leading to it, the disturbed ground around the entrance. He noted a set of tire tracks nearby, partially covered but unmistakable, wide, deep, consistent with a heavy-duty truck. Snow crunched behind him, not loud, not careless, close. Shadow reacted first, turning sharply, ears pinned back, a low warning vibrating through his chest. Matthew pivoted, heart accelerating now, instincts catching up to reality. A sound cut through the forest, the crack of a gunshot. It echoed sharply, snapping the quiet apart, sending birds exploding from the trees. Snow shook loose from branches, cascading down in blinding sheets. The shot did not hit them. Matthew knew that instantly. It was not aimed. It was a message. Shadow barked once, sharp and controlled, then pressed close to Matthew's leg, ready to move. Matthew did not hesitate. "Back," he whispered. They retreated immediately, not running blindly but moving with purpose, putting trees between themselves and the sound. Matthew's training kicked in fully now, every movement economical, every breath measured. Another shot rang out, closer this time, the sound carried unnaturally far by the cold air and snow. Matthew felt the vibration through his chest. Adrenaline surged, but fear did not take hold. This was not panic. This was calculation. They reached the denser brush near the trail and used it for cover, moving downhill, away from the cabin. Snow swallowed their tracks quickly, softening each step. Only when they were far enough away did Matthew slow. Shadow's breathing was steady. His eyes burned with alertness, not distress. Matthew crouched, resting a hand briefly on the dog's shoulder. "Good," he murmured. "Good work." The forest returned to its uneasy quiet, as if holding its breath again. Matthew stood there for a long moment, letting his heart rate settle. He replayed the sounds, the distance, the direction. Whoever had fired the shots had wanted to be heard, not to hit. A warning, a boundary, message received. Matthew turned back toward town, mind already shifting into the next phase. Evidence gathered, threat confirmed. Timing mattered now. The snow continued to fall lightly, covering tracks, blurring edges, trying its best to erase the truth beneath it. It failed. The second Christmas night arrived without apology. The storm returned as if insulted by the brief pause it had been forced to take, rolling down from the mountains with heavier snow and a sharper wind. Pine Hollow disappeared beneath it. Streets erased, fences swallowed, the world reduced to motion and sound. The trees groaned under fresh weight, and the sky pressed so low it felt like it might collapse onto the roofs below. Matthew Cole stood at the window of his cabin, watching the forest bend and sway. The glass rattled softly in its frame. He had layered the windows with insulating film earlier that day, an old habit from winters past. But the cold still found its way inside. Cold always did. Behind him, the cabin glowed warm and steady. Noel and Grace slept inside a reinforced crate near the hearth, wrapped in blankets that carried Matthew's scent. They were stronger now, still small, still vulnerable, but no longer clinging to life by a thread. Grace's white chest patch rose and fell in an even rhythm. Noel twitched occasionally in his sleep, paws moving as if chasing something kinder than memory. Shadow lay stretched across the floor in front of them, his body positioned deliberately, blocking the most direct path from the door. At 7 years old, he did not waste energy posturing. His presence alone was enough. Matthew checked his phone again. 1 bar of signal, sometimes none. He opened the message thread with Eleanor Brooks and typed carefully, conserving battery and clarity. Coordinates, photos, description of the rope, the direction of the tracks, the sound of the gunshots. He did not speculate, he did not plead. He sent it. The message took longer than usual to deliver, the small icon spinning as if uncertain. Finally, it went through. Matthew exhaled slowly. That was all he could do. He set the phone down and turned back to the room, listening. The fire popped softly. The wind screamed outside. Shadow's ears flicked once, then stilled. Matthew moved deliberately, checking the locks on the door and windows, not in panic, but preparation. He did not retrieve his rifle. It remained secured in its case. Instead, he poured himself a mug of coffee gone lukewarm hours ago and leaned against the counter. Fear, he knew, was contagious. If he let it in, it would spread. The knock came shortly after dusk, fully fell. 3 heavy blows against the door. Hard. Intentional. Shadow rose instantly, placing himself between the crate and the sound, hackles lifting just enough to show readiness without chaos. A low growl rolled through his chest, controlled and restrained. Matthew raised a hand. Shadow held. Matthew did not reach for a weapon. He walked to the door and stood still, listening. The wind carried voices this time, 2 of them, muffled, close. Matthew rested his palm flat against the wood, grounding himself in the solidity of it. "I'm armed," one voice called out. "Open up." Matthew recognized the tone, not drunk, not panicked, aggressive in a practiced way. He did not answer. Another voice joined the first, sharper, impatient. "We know you're in there." Shadow's growl deepened, but did not escalate. Matthew took a breath. This was not a standoff born of misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Whoever stood outside had chosen this night, this storm, believing isolation would protect them. They were wrong. Matthew stepped closer to the door, but did not open it. "You should leave," he said calmly, his voice steady, carrying through the wood. "The storm's not going to make this easier." A short laugh came from outside. "You think you can wait us out?" Matthew did not respond. Something struck the side of the cabin, a fist or a boot, testing. The structure held. Matthew had built it to. Shadow barked once, sharp and warning. "Easy," Matthew murmured without turning. Time stretched thin. Then, faintly at first, a new sound threaded through the storm. Sirens, distant but unmistakable. The voices outside shifted. Tension changed shape. One of the men cursed under his breath. "Move!" the sharper voice hissed. A gunshot cracked the night. The bullet struck the porch railing, splintering wood, sending fragments flying. The sound reverberated through the cabin, loud enough to wake the puppies, who whined softly. Shadow lunged forward, positioning himself more firmly, body blocking, teeth bared now. Matthew remained still. He did not fire back. He did not open the door. He waited. Another siren joined the first, closer now, cutting through the storm with purpose. Flashing lights began to bleed through the trees, red and blue diffused by snow. The men outside ran. Matthew listened to their footsteps retreating, uneven and hurried, swallowed quickly by the wind and forest. Moments later, headlights tore through the darkness, illuminating the clearing in harsh white beams. Vehicles skidded to a halt, doors slammed, voices shouted commands, sharp and practiced. Sheriff Daniel Harper emerged from the storm, his tall frame wrapped in a heavy coat, his face lined with years of responsibility, and too many winters like this one. He was a man in his mid-50s, broad-chested, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed little. He had known Matthew since his first year on the force. They did not speak often, but when they did, it mattered. "Matthew!" Harper called out. "You all right?" Matthew opened the door at last. Cold rushed in, but relief followed close behind. Harper took in the scene in seconds. The splintered railing, the dog standing guard, the faint sounds from the crate near the fire. "You did the right thing," Harper said quietly, stepping inside. "You waited." Matthew nodded. "They wanted a reaction." Harper's mouth tightened. "They won't get another chance." Deputies moved quickly, checking the perimeter, radios crackling. Snow continued to fall. relentless, indifferent. Harper glanced toward the puppies. Those the ones? Yes. Harper exhaled slowly. Hell of a Christmas. Matthew met his gaze. It's not a night for fear. Harper studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. No, he agreed. It's not. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady. Shadow finally relaxing enough to lie down again, his body still angled protectively. The house stood. Not because of guns, but because no one inside had stepped back. Spring did not arrive in Pine Hollow with celebration. It came cautiously, as if unsure whether it was welcome after the winter it had followed. Snow lingered in the shadows of buildings and beneath the pines long after the calendar suggested it should be gone. Ice retreated inch by inch from the riverbanks. The air softened, carrying the scent of wet earth and thawing needles, a smell that promised renewal without guaranteeing it. Matthew Cole noticed the change not by temperature, but by sound. Water. It dripped steadily from the edge of his cabin roof, striking the ground in slow, patient rhythms. Snow melted beneath the porch, turning into shallow streams that traced quiet paths through the dirt. For the first time in months, the forest sounded alive rather than buried. Matthew stood on the porch, sleeves rolled up, watching 3 dogs move across the clearing. Noel had grown quickly. He was tall for his age, his legs already long and strong, his coat thickening into a rich sable with a confident dark mask. There was a steadiness to him, a natural assurance that drew the eye without demanding it. He moved with curiosity rather than caution, eager but not reckless, a dog who seemed to believe the world might yet be kind. Grace followed more slowly. She remained smaller, lighter in build, her white chest patch now clearly defined against her darker fur. Her eyes were gentler, more thoughtful. Where Noel charged ahead, Grace paused, assessed, then chose her steps carefully. She watched people closely, learning moods, remembering tones. Her early fragility had shaped her, not into weakness, but into attentiveness, and Shadow watched them both. Age had settled more visibly into his body. His movements were slower now, joints stiff in the mornings, muzzle noticeably silvered, but his presence remained constant, his authority unquestioned. Noel respected him instinctively. Grace stayed close to his side, pressing against him when the world felt too loud. Shadow had become something more than a guardian. He was a teacher. Matthew leaned against the porch railing, a mug of coffee warming his hands. He looked older than he had that winter, though not in the way exhaustion ages a man. His posture had softened. His eyes no longer scanned the tree line with constant vigilance. The tightness he had carried for years had eased, replaced by something quieter and steadier. The old lumber shed stood in the distance, no longer abandoned. It had taken months of paperwork, inspections, and long conversations with county officials, but it now bore a new name carved into a wooden sign above the door: North Star Haven. The building had been reinforced, cleaned, rebuilt with intention. Inside were clean kennels, medical supplies, space for animals waiting for care or homes. Volunteers from Pine Hollow came and went, bringing food, blankets, their children, their questions. It was not a grand operation. It did not seek attention. It simply existed. Matthew had not planned it. He had only agreed to stay long enough to make sure the puppies were safe, long enough to help with repairs, long enough to answer a few questions. Somewhere along the way, staying had turned into belonging. He was not called a hero. He never corrected anyone who tried. Late that afternoon, Eleanor Brooks walked up the path toward the cabin. She moved carefully, not because she was frail, but because she respected the ground beneath her feet. Spring had done its work unevenly. Eleanor wore a light jacket, her hair now shorter than it had been in winter, cut for practicality. Time had etched deeper lines at the corners of her eyes, but they only made her expressions more readable. She smiled when she saw the dogs. "They've grown," she said, as if she were commenting on the weather. Matthew nodded. "They had good teachers." Shadow lifted his head at the sound of her voice and thumped his tail once against the ground in acknowledgement. Eleanor stepped onto the porch and stood beside Matthew, both of them watching Noel and Grace tumble awkwardly through play, their paws slipping slightly on the damp earth. "You did good work," she said quietly. Matthew shook his head. "A lot of people did." Eleanor accepted that without argument. They stood in companionable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of spring asserting itself. Birds called from the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck wood at North Star Haven, steady and purposeful. After a moment, Eleanor spoke again. "People have been asking questions," she said. "About that night, about the timing." Matthew glanced at her. "And they want to know if it was a miracle." Matthew considered the word. He thought of the storm, the rope, the cold. He thought of Shadow's instincts, of his own choice to stop the car when every practical reason told him not to. He thought of the way fear had tried to claim that night and failed. "No," he said finally. Eleanor tilted her head, studying him. "I don't think it was a miracle," Matthew continued. "I think it was a door." She waited. "I think something knocked," he said, "and I opened it." Eleanor smiled then, a small, knowing smile that carried no triumph. "That's usually how it works," she said. Noel bounded toward the porch, stopping just short of Shadow, as if remembering a lesson. Grace followed, slower, pressing her shoulder briefly against Shadow's leg before sitting. Shadow remained still, dignified, accepting their closeness without comment. Eleanor watched the scene, her eyes softening. "Winter teaches us to survive," she said, "but spring asks us to choose what comes next." Matthew looked out across the clearing, toward the haven, toward the town beyond, small and stubborn against the mountains. "I chose to stay," he said simply. Eleanor nodded. "That's enough." As the sun dipped lower, the last patches of snow glistened briefly before melting into the soil, water soaked into the ground, feeding roots that had waited patiently all winter. The snow did not vanish all at once. It let go. And in Pine Hollow, something else did too. In the quiet ending of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes they come through a tired heart that chooses to stop, instead of turning away, through a loyal companion who listens when others do not, and through a simple act of courage on an ordinary night. In our daily lives, we all face moments when we feel exhausted, discouraged, or tempted to keep moving past pain that is not ours to carry. But God often places a quiet calling in our path, asking only that we open our eyes and our hearts. When we choose compassion over convenience, He can turn even the coldest night into a beginning. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe that God's gentle miracles still walk beside us in everyday life, please type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And please remember to press subscribe to support this YouTube channel so we can continue bringing you stories of faith, love, and quiet miracles.